Hello students. Today we are going to talk about the impact of British colonization on the origin of the Indian English poetry. We've already been talking about the origin of Indian English poetry in the earlier recordings, but today I would like to talk about the impact of British colonization. I am Anamika Shukla from the School of Humanities, Indira Gandhi National Open University. Before laying focus on the impact of British colonization on the history of India, let us try and analyze the effect of British imperialism. What I mean to say is, we're trying to understand how British imperialism affected the growth and development of Indian English poetry. We will also try to examine how we as Indians bore the brunt of Western culture and how extensive was the impact of British colonization on the origin of Indian poetry and also on the evolution of the Indian poetry written in English. This imperialism entirely transformed the Indian society. So we need to understand the different views of Indian philosophers and the thinkers from India. How do they kind of look towards this Indo-British encounter? It is often suggested that Indian English literature and Indian English poetry specifically was the first literary genre which emerged. So it is generally believed that English poetry, which is the first of the literary genre to emerge, was the product of a larger cultural and civilizational encounter. So this cultural and civilizational encounter between Britain and India laid lot of impact on the writings of poetry in India in English language. We also try and understand this encounter before we focus directly on the origin and evolution of Indian English poetry. The first thing that I'd like to say is that Britain was not the first European country to impact upon India. Of course, there were earlier and much vaunted conquests of India, for example, by Alexander the Great. They occurred way back, and Alexander also succeeded in defeating only one of the Indian rulers, Paurava, who was the king of Punjab, and this defeat, in fact, was achieved at a tremendous cost. Now, within 20 years of his death, much of the territory that he had conquered was reconquered by one of the most powerful Indian emperors, namely Chandragupta Maurya. So, and again, I would say, like even prior to Alexander's raid on India, India had commercial and cultural ties with ancient Europe, mainly Greece and Rome. But these were more or less on an equal and reciprocal footing. Now, what happened is it took another roughly around 1800 years for Europe to register its next significant clash with India. Now, this clash, why I called it a significant clash, is because it is this encounter which we call a cultural and civilizational encounter. It has lot of impact on the writings of Indian authors, which they wrote in the language which was considered alien at that time. In the intervening years, trade and cultural exchange did take place. But what happened is, after the rise of Islam, it was not as freely as it was happening earlier. So the Arabs began to rule most of the Middle East and Asia Minor, and as a result, the European urgency to discover new sea routes to the Indian continent increased, and this all happened in the Middle Ages. Vasco da Gama in 1498 was another soldier who came over and built an empire, who landed on the shores of South India, namely Cochin. And the Indo-Portuguese encounter is little discussed today outside the circles of literature, because it was totally eclipsed and overtaken by the Indo-British encounter. But it is very, very important to go back to this earlier Indo-European clash for two reasons. The first and the foremost reason is you have to make a comparison of the Portuguese and British imperialism, not only because it reveals not only two faces of Europe, but also, the Indian response reveals two faces of India. So we need to understand both the encounters. We need to understand the Portuguese, and we also need to understand the British imperialism, these clashes, and I would call them the earlier Indo-European clashes, to understand the two faces of Europe. Simultaneously, it also reveals two faces of India. The Portuguese intervention in India was especially different from the British, because it was more informed and it was with a different type of imperial ideology. There were military conquest, there were conversions, there was profit, that order was its, and the motivational factors were entirely different. So the Portuguese rule was consolidated. It was more of a traditional form of imperialism, and the Portuguese rule was also consolidated in areas like Goa and all. Now the native culture was altered, and it happened more radically as compared to British colonization. The Portuguese conquest of Indian territories was accomplished with much more bloodshed and naked violence than the British conquest. So when the Portuguese sought to do, what they sought to do was to impose their own religion. They wanted to impose their own culture on the Indians. They tried to create a new kind of society in the East, and their impact was limited when you compare to the impact of the British colonization. And yes, definitely the British colonization followed the Portuguese colonization. So one reason for this is that the conquest of India could not be effected merely through an assertion of cultural or military superiority. When Britain conquered India, it was not just another country or culture defeating ours. It was not just the triumph of Britain or Europe, but it was the triumph of modernity. Britain was, it was a powerful country, and it kind of ruled us by a different kind of engine, different kind of energy. They ascended the throne, and Europe had learned to capture the hidden powers of our culture, of our society. The Industrial Revolution of the 1780s and the years of preparation which preceded it, they have given Britain a military and a technological advantage. They were also filled with cultural advantage over India, and everything was unprecedented. So I would say that the Portuguese rule did give way to British rule, it did make a significant impact on the mind of India and Europe. For nearly around 100 years, Eastern things, they were primarily ruling. They came to Europe, they mediated through the Portuguese language and people. So this is all that we've been discussing. Now, you also know how this was, true. How this was true of most Indian lexical borrowings from the European languages, including English. And that is how the first Indian words in English came via the Portuguese language. So, this is how the English paved its way to Indian language. But as the Indian side too, what happened was Europe, especially the Roman Catholics, came to be nativized in a unique new community in Goa. Now, this community of Indian Christians played an important role in the modernization of India. Our first Indian English poet, Henry Derozio, belonged to this community. He is probably a shortened version of a common Portuguese uh, uh, community which kind of converted Hindus, and they adopted a lot of things from our culture, but they also inherited a lot of things from the Portuguese culture, and they got it to our country. Now, all this suggests that it was the product of the Indo-Portuguese encounter. Now, other Indian English poets such as Dom Moraes and Charmaine de Souza also belong to this community of Goan Christians. So, as I've been suggesting or talking earlier, Portuguese colonization in India failed, or it was less successful. It was partially successful, and one reason for this was that it was very, very narrow-minded, very, very limited in its approach and in its method. So it presented the conservative face of Europe. Another important thing that we need to understand is that in Europe itself, the hegemony of the Roman Catholic Church, which has, it has conspired to divide the vast territories of the New World between the countries, Spain and Portugal, it was also being challenged. Both the Dutch and the English were challenging Spain, as the rising tide of Protestantism was also being challenged, because it was also challenging the Roman Catholic Church itself. Charter of East India Company took place during the reign of one of the British's greatest monarch, Queen Elizabeth, and the defeat of Spanish Armada in 1588 by Britain, and all these incidents marked a decisive point in the rise of British power. So probably over the next 200 to 250 years, Britain was supposed to emerge as the greatest power, not only in Europe, but throughout the whole world. When we talk about British imperialism, because it is equally important to understand the impact of British imperialism on the Indian society, and that is how on the language and literature of our country. So British imperialism, we can say it has been backed because it was a more modern and secular outlook, and they started by concentrating on trade. They had a policy of non-interference with the religion and cultural traditions. So they never wanted to interfere with the religion of the country, with the culture of the country. They never wanted to, affect the cultural traditions of the people it conquered. So the conquest itself was not the aim to begin with. They never started with the purpose of, having a rise or to conquer the religion. Okay, so the Britishers never had a policy to conquer the religion or the cultural traditions of the country. They just wanted to have trade with the country. And, the East India Company, in its kind of fight to protect its trade interests, there was a volatile political situation, and they wanted to preserve or protect the trade interests. So they never intended to interfere into the cultural or the political scenario, but then, they just wanted to protect the trade interests, and that is how East India Company, kind of interfered, or probably they got an opportunity to meddle in the affairs of the Indian princes. Now the company used its leverages as a seriously neutral outsider to take advantage. But after the settlements of the trade with the people in Surat and Hooghly, they attacked people there, and they began to fortify them and to arm, they started arming themselves. So what happened was, it raised an army. Now, the army was raised mostly by the recruiting local mercenaries and trained them in modern European methods of warfare. The Battle of Plassey happened in 1757, and a well-trained army of Indians, which was led by a small band of British officers under Robert Clive, defeated the huge but divided army of Siraj-ud-Daulah. So, after defeating the army of Siraj-ud-Daulah, the Nawab of Bengal, they marched ahead. Now, the model of this battle came to be seen as a unique Indian tribute to the Raj, the Victorian Memorial in Calcutta. So, now how this Battle of Plassey, it inaugurated a series of military victories for the British, and finally it culminated in an almost unprecedented paramountcy of the whole of the Indian subcontinent. So, and through this conquest, the Indian bore the full brunt of Western, or properly the modern culture. The impact was so extensive and thorough, and it entirely transformed the Indian society. Such an upheaval had no parallel in Indian history. Even the impact of the Muslim rulers in India has been less far-reaching. So it is not for us to analyze or describe this impact in great detail, but that will not only be outside the scope of this course, but we also need to understand, our central concern is the Indian English poetry. So, Indian English poetry actually does not really engage directly with British colonization or with several of its effects, which have been trying to understand. But, there are few poems which talk about racism. They talk about imperialism. They also talk about nationalism, and they talk about, they are the master narratives of our time. But each and every poem, it will deal with these kind of issues. Now, they deal either directly or indirectly. There are a great number of contemporary poems which talk about poverty, which talk about violence. They also talk about the urban conditions and other things. So these realities, they arise partly out of our colonial heritage. So in fact, the colonial heritage is responsible for the condition of India, and this condition of India was, and it also remains, the major theme and also the major preoccupation of our thinkers, our scholars, our artists, and our intellectuals. Because they wrote sonnets which lamented the fall of India. And it is precisely this fall which we come across throughout the poems, throughout literature. We need to recover all this, and this was the major outcome of the colonial intervention. So the colonial intervention, I would again and again reiterate the fact that colonialism, was, you cannot call it innocent. It was well informed, because it had its own political, social impact. And then those impacts were so dangerous, because for a variety of reasons, it is, you cannot call it a simplistic nationalism when we kind of write poetry which is a product of this colonial encounter, this cultural encounter. This is probably, you have to understand, because all this is the outcome of our recent history. The literature is the outcome of the history of the past. It is very important, to well understand what sort of stand our thinkers, our writers, our authors, our poets took towards colonialism. There were many who agreed with the British, that colonization and colonialism was a civilizing and modernizing force, and therefore they were benefited. Now, there were many others who treated it as a blessing in disguise, but they treated it as an act of providence. But there were other nationalists, they were of a different view. They thought that British rule saved the Indian culture, the Indian society from the domination of uh, other communities. They allowed them to recoup their strength and eventually regard, and regain their lost national spirit or nationalism. So there were, and there still are, people who kind of term modernization, believing that British rule assured in liberal values and also helped India to reform a less corrupt and traditional society. So, let us not get into the conflict or into the discussion of this, but we have to understand that this colonial encounter and this cultural encounter did impact the literature of the times. It did impact the writings, the poetry of the times, because our subject matter, our themes, everything is originating, is being derived from the impact of this cultural collision. Probably, here we have tried to understand how did India borrow the words and languages, how did English language came into the country, how did they come along with the trading people who landed on the land of our country. So this is how they came to India. We kind of not only picked up or chose to write in their language, we also wrote about the subjects, the theme, the topics, the subject matter that we chose to write about were also the result or the outcome of this colonial encounter. So this is how the colonization has impacted the origin and also the evolution of Indian poetry which is written in English.